Isis Unveiled, Volume 1. By Helena Blavatsky. Chapter 1. Ancient Traditions and Cyclic Progression. There exists somewhere within this vast world an ancient tome, so extraordinarily archaic that our modern antiquarians might deliberate over its pages for an indefinite duration, and still not fully agree as to the nature of the fabric upon which it is inscribed. It stands as the singular original manuscript presently in existence. The most ancient Hebrew document concerning occult learning, the Sifrot Zinuta, was compiled from it, and that at a time when the former was already regarded in the light of a literary relic. One of its illustrations depicts the divine essence emanating from Adam like a luminous arc proceeding to form a circle, and then, having attained the zenith of its circumference, the ineffable glory retroflexes and returns to earth, drawing a more exalted iteration of humanity within its vortex. As it draws progressively closer to our planet, the emanation grows increasingly shadowy, until upon touching the ground it manifests as black as night. A conviction, ostensibly founded upon 70,000 years of experience, as they allege, has been maintained by Hermetic philosophers of all periods that matter has in time become, through sin, markedly more gross and dense than it was at man's initial formation, that, in the beginning, the human body was of a semi-ethereal nature, and that, before the fall, mankind communed unimpeded with the presently unseen universes. But since that epoch matter has become the formidable barrier between us and the realm of spirits. The most archaic esoteric traditions also instruct that, before the mystic Adam, numerous races of human beings lived and perished, each yielding its place in turn to another. Were these antecedent types more perfect? Did any of them belong to the winged race of men delineated by Plato in Phaedrus? It constitutes the specific province of science to resolve the problem. The subterranean caverns of France and the relics of the Stone Age furnish a point at which to begin. As the cycle advanced, man's eyes were progressively opened, until he attained a comprehension of good and evil equivalent to that of the Elohim themselves. Having reached its apex, the cycle commenced its downward trajectory. When the arc attained a specific juncture which aligned it parallel with the fixed axis of our terrestrial plane, the man was endowed by nature with coats of skin, and the Lord God clothed them. This identical belief in the pre-existence of a vastly more spiritual race than the one to which we presently belong can be traced back to the primordial traditions of nearly every populace. In the ancient Quiche manuscript, published by Brasser de Bourbourg, the Popol Vuh, the inaugural men are chronicled as a race that could reason and speak, whose vision was boundless, and who comprehended all things instantaneously. According to Philo Judaeus, the atmosphere is populated by an invisible host of spirits, certain of whom are free from evil and immortal, and others are pernicious and mortal. From the sons of El we are descended, and sons of El must we become once more. And the unequivocal declaration of the anonymous Gnostic who authored the Gospel according to John, that as many as received him, who practically adhered to the esoteric doctrine of Jesus, would become the sons of God, points to the very same conviction. "Know ye not ye are gods?" exclaimed the Master. Plato admirably delineates in Phaedrus the state in which man formerly existed, and what he is destined to become again. Before and after the forfeiture of his wings, when he dwelled among the gods, functioning as a god himself in the ethereal realm. From the most remote epochs, religious philosophies instructed that the entirety of the universe was replete with divine and spiritual entities of diverse races. From one of these evolved, over the progression of time, Adam, the primordial man. The Kalmucks and select tribes of Siberia similarly describe within their legends creations that predated our current race. These beings, they assert, were endowed with virtually boundless knowledge, and in their sheer audacity even threatened rebellion against the great chief spirit. To penalize their presumption and enforce humility, he imprisoned them in corporeal forms, and thereby constricted their sensory faculties. From these they can escape but through protracted repentance, rigorous self-purification, and elevated development. Their shamans, they surmise, occasionally partake in the divine powers originally possessed by all human beings. Ancient traditions supported by modern research. The Astor Library of New York has recently been enriched by the acquisition of a facsimile of an Egyptian medical treatise, inscribed in the 16th century BC, or more precisely 1552 BC, which, in accordance with the commonly accepted chronology, marks the period when Moses was precisely 21 years of age. The original is drafted upon the inner bark of Cyperus papyrus, and has been pronounced by Professor Schenk of Leipzig not merely genuine, but indisputably the most immaculate specimen ever discovered. It comprises a solitary sheet of yellow-brown papyrus of the finest quality, 3/10 of a meter wide, exceeding 20 meters in length, and forming one roll divided into 110 pages, all meticulously numbered. It was procured in Egypt in 1872 to 1873 by the archaeologist Ebers, of an affluent Arab resident of Luxor. The New York Tribune, commenting upon the circumstance, states, "The papyrus bears internal evidence of constituting one of the 6 Hermetic books on medicine, catalogued by Clement of Alexandria." The editor further remarks, "At the time of Iamblichus, 363 AD, the priests of Egypt exhibited 42 texts which they ascribed to Hermes, Thuti. Of these, according to that author, 36 encompassed the comprehensive history of all human knowledge, the final 6 treated of anatomy, of pathology, of afflictions of the eye, instruments of surgery, and of medicinal remedies. The Papyrus Ebers is indisputably one of these archaic Hermetic works. If so brilliant a ray of illumination has been cast upon ancient Egyptian science, by the incidental encounter of the German archaeologist with one affluent Arab from Luxor, how can we anticipate the magnitude of enlightenment that may be introduced into the obscure crypts of history by an equally fortuitous meeting between some other prosperous Egyptian and another enterprising scholar of antiquity? The findings of modern science do not contradict the most archaic traditions which claim an incredible antiquity for our race. Within recent years, geology, which previously had conceded only that mankind might be traced as far back as the Tertiary period, has uncovered irrefutable proofs that human existence antedates the final glaciation of Europe over 250,000 years. A formidable conundrum, this, for patristic theology to resolve, but an accepted verity with the ancient philosophers. Moreover, fossilized implements have been exhumed in conjunction with human remains, which demonstrate that prehistoric man engaged in hunting during those remote epochs, and possessed the requisite knowledge to kindle a fire. But the decisive forward stride has not yet been taken in this search for the origin of the race. Science arrives at an absolute impasse, and waits for forthcoming proofs. Unfortunately, anthropology and psychology possess no Cuvier. Neither geologists nor archaeologists are capable of reconstructing, from the fragmentary remnants discovered thus far, the flawless framework of the tripartite man, physical, intellectual, and spiritual. Because the fossilized implements of mankind are observed to grow increasingly crude and unrefined as geology penetrates deeper into the bowels of the earth, it seems a proof to science that the closer we approach the inception of humanity, the more savage and bestial man must inherently be. Peculiar logic. Does the discovery of remains within the caves of Devon conclusively prove that there existed no highly civilized contemporary races during that era? When the current population of the Earth have vanished, and some archaeologist belonging to a forthcoming race in the distant future shall excavate the domestic implements of one of our Indian or Andaman Island tribes, will he be justified in concluding that mankind in the 19th century was merely emerging from the Stone Age? It has recently become fashionable to speak disparagingly of the untenable conceptions of an uncultivated past, as if it were feasible to obscure behind a mere epigram the vast intellectual quarries out of which the reputations of so numerous a multitude of modern philosophers have been hewn. Much as Tyndall is perpetually disposed to disparage the ancient philosophers, through the repackaging of whose ideas more than one distinguished scientist has garnered honor and credit, so too do modern geologists appear increasingly inclined to assume that all archaic races contemporaneously languished in a state of dense barbarism. Yet not all of our foremost authorities concur with this opinion. Several of the most eminent maintain precisely the reverse. Max Muller, for instance, observes, "Many phenomena remain unintelligible to us, and the hieroglyphic language of antiquity records but half of the mind's unconscious intentions. Yet increasingly the image of man, in whatever clime we encounter him, rises before us noble and immaculate from the very beginning. Even his errors we learn to comprehend, even his dreams we begin to interpret. As far back as we may trace the footsteps of man, even upon the lowest strata of history, we observe the divine gift of a sound and sober intellect belonging to him from the very first, and the notion of a humanity emerging slowly from the depths of an animal brutality can never be maintained again. The progress of mankind marked by cycles. As it is presently deemed unphilosophical to inquire into first causes, scientists now occupy themselves with examining their physical effects. The domain of scientific investigation is therefore circumscribed by physical nature. When once its limits are reached, inquiry must cease, and their labors be recommenced. With all due deference to our learned men, they resemble the squirrel upon its revolving wheel, for they are condemned to turn their matter over and over again. Science constitutes a mighty potency, and it is not for us pygmies to question her. However, the scientists are not themselves science embodied any more than the denizens of our planet are the planet itself. We possess neither the right to demand, nor the power to compel our modern-day philosopher to accept without challenge a geographical description of the dark side of the moon. But, if during some lunar cataclysm one of its inhabitants were to be hurled thence into the attraction of our atmosphere, and land, safe and sound, at Dr. Carpenter's door, he would be indictable as recreant to professional duty should he fail to set the physical problem at rest. For a man of science to decline an opportunity to investigate any novel phenomenon, whether it presents itself in the guise of a man from the moon or a phantom from the Eddy homestead, is equally reprehensible. Whether arrived at through the methodology of Aristotle or that of Plato, we need not pause to inquire, but it remains a fact that both the inner and outer natures of man are purported to have been thoroughly comprehended by the ancient andrologists. Notwithstanding the superficial hypotheses of geologists, we are beginning to receive almost daily proofs corroborating the assertions of those philosophers. They partitioned the interminable epochs of human existence upon this planet into cycles, during each of which mankind gradually attained the culminating zenith of highest civilization and subsequently relapsed into abject barbarism. To what eminence the race had several times ascended in its progress may be faintly surmised from the wondrous monuments of antiquity, still visible, and the descriptions provided by Herodotus of other marvels of which no traces now remain. Even in his era, the gigantic structures of numerous pyramids and world-renowned temples were but masses of ruins. Scattered by the unrelenting hand of time, they are described by the father of history as these venerable witnesses to the long bygone glory of departed ancestors. He shrinks from speaking of divine matters, offering posterity but an imperfect description from hearsay of certain marvelous subterranean chambers of the labyrinth, where lay, and now lie, concealed, the sacred remains of the king initiates. We may judge, moreover, of the lofty civilization achieved during certain periods of antiquity by the historical descriptions of the Ptolemaic ages. Yet in that epoch the arts and sciences were deemed to be degenerating, and the secrets of several among the former had already been lost. During the recent excavations by Mariette Bay, at the foot of the pyramids, statues of wood and various other relics have been exhumed, demonstrating that long before the period of the earliest dynasties the Egyptians had attained a refinement and perfection calculated to excite the wonder of even the most ardent admirers of Grecian art. Bayard Taylor describes these statues in one of his lectures, and informs us that the beauty of the heads, ornamented with eyes of precious stones and copper eyelids, remains unsurpassed. Far beneath the stratum of sand in which lay the remains gathered into the collections of Lepsius, Abbott, and the British Museum, were found buried the tangible proofs of the Hermetic doctrine of cycles which has been previously explained. Dr. Schliemann, the enthusiastic Hellenist, has recently discovered, during his excavations in the Troad, abundant evidence of this identical gradual transition from barbarism to civilization, and from civilization back into barbarism again. Why then should we feel so reluctant to concede the possibility that, if the antediluvians were so vastly better versed than ourselves in certain sciences as to have been perfectly acquainted with important arts, which we now term lost, they might equally have excelled in psychological knowledge? Such a hypothesis must be deemed as reasonable as any other until countervailing evidence is discovered to dismantle it. Every genuine savant concedes that in manifold respects human knowledge remains in its infancy. Could it be that our present cycle commenced in ages comparatively recent? These cycles, according to Chaldean philosophy, do not encompass all of mankind at one and the same time. Professor Draper partially corroborates this view by observing that the periods into which geology has found it convenient to divide the progress of human civilization are not abrupt epochs holding true simultaneously for the entirety of the human race, providing as an instance the wandering Indians of America, who are only at this present moment emerging from the Stone Age. Thus more than once men of science have unwittingly confirmed the testimony of the ancients. Ancient cryptic science. Any Kabbalist thoroughly acquainted with the Pythagorean system of numerals and geometry can demonstrate that the metaphysical views of Plato were founded upon the strictest mathematical principles. True mathematics, asserts the Magikon, is something with which all higher sciences are connected. Common mathematics is but a deceitful phantasmagoria, whose highly lauded infallibility arises solely from this, that materials, conditions, and references are made its foundation. Scientists who believe they have adopted the Aristotelian method solely because they creep when they do not run from demonstrated particulars to universals, glorify this method of inductive philosophy, and reject that of Plato, which they dismiss as unsubstantial. Professor Draper laments that such speculative mystics as Ammonius Saccas and Plotinus should have usurped the place of the severe geometers of the old museum. He neglects the fact that geometry, of all sciences the singular discipline that proceeds from universals to particulars, was precisely the method employed by Plato in his philosophy. So long as exact science confines its observations to physical conditions and proceeds Aristotle-like, it certainly cannot fail. Yet notwithstanding that the world of matter appears boundless to us, it remains finite, and thus materialism will turn forever within this vitiated circle, entirely unable to soar higher than the circumference permits. The cosmological theory of numerals which Pythagoras acquired from the Egyptian hierophants is alone capable of reconciling the two units, matter and spirit, compelling each to demonstrate the other mathematically. The sacred numbers of the universe in their esoteric combination resolve the great problem and elucidate the theory of radiation and the cycle of emanations. The lower orders before they evolve into superior ones must emanate from the higher spiritual ones, and when arrived at the turning point, be reabsorbed again into the infinite. Physiology, akin to all else within this world of perpetual evolution, is governed by the cyclic revolution. Just as it currently appears to be barely emerging from the shadows of the lower arc, so it may one day be proven to have occupied the zenith of the circumference of the circle far earlier than the days of Pythagoras. Moccus, the Sidonian, the physiologist and instructor in the science of anatomy, flourished long before the sage of Samos, and the latter received the sacred instructions from his disciples and descendants. Pythagoras, the pure philosopher, the deeply versed in the more profound phenomena of nature, the noble inheritor of ancient lore, whose great aim was to liberate the soul from the fetters of sense and compel it to realize its powers, must live eternally in human memory. The impenetrable veil of arcane secrecy was cast over the sciences taught within the sanctuary. This accounts for the modern depreciation of the ancient philosophies. Even Plato and Philo-Judaeus have been accused by many a commentator of absurd inconsistencies, whereas the design which underlies the maze of metaphysical contradictions so perplexing to the reader of the Timaeus is all too evident. Yet has Plato ever been read with true comprehension by one of the expounders of the classics? This is a question warranted by the criticisms to be found in such authors as Stahlbaum, Schleiermacher, Ficinus, the Latin translation, Haindorff, Sydenham, Buttman, Taylor, and Burgess, to say nothing of lesser authorities. The covert allusions of the Greek philosopher to esoteric matters have manifestly baffled these commentators to the utmost degree. They not only with unblushing coolness suggest as to certain difficult passages that another phraseology was evidently intended, but they audaciously execute the changes. The Orphic line of the song, The Order of the Sixth Race Close, which can solely be interpreted as a reference to the sixth race evolved in the consecutive evolution of the spheres, Burgess says, was evidently extracted from a cosmogony wherein man was feigned to be created the last. Ought not one who undertakes to edit another's works at least comprehend what his author means? Indeed, the ancient philosophers appear to be generally regarded, even by the least prejudiced among our modern critics, to have lacked that profundity and thorough mastery in the exact sciences of which our century is so boastful. It is even questioned whether they understood that basic scientific principle. Nothing comes from nothing. If they suspected the indestructibility of matter at all, assert these commentators, it was not in consequence of a firmly established formula but solely through intuitional reasoning and by analogy. We maintain the contrary opinion. The speculations of these philosophers upon matter were open to public criticism, but their teachings in regard to spiritual matters were profoundly esoteric. Being thus sworn to secrecy and religious silence upon abstruse subjects involving the relations of spirit and matter, they rivaled one another in their ingenious methods for concealing their true convictions. The doctrine of metempsychosis has been abundantly ridiculed by men of science and rejected by theologians, yet if it had been appropriately comprehended in its application to the indestructibility of matter and the immortality of spirit, it would have been recognized as a sublime conception. Should we not first examine the subject from the standpoint of the ancients before venturing to disparage its teachers? The resolution of the great problem of eternity belongs neither to religious superstition nor to gross materialism. The harmony and mathematical equiformity of the dual evolution, spiritual and physical, are elucidated solely in the universal numerals of Pythagoras, who constructed his system entirely upon the so-called metrical speech of the Hindu Vedas. It is but recently that one of the most zealous Sanskrit scholars, Martin Haug, undertook the translation of the Aitareya Brahmana of the Rigveda. It had been till that time entirely unknown, and these explanations indicate beyond dispute the identity of the Pythagorean and Brahmanical systems. In both, the esoteric significance is derived from the number. In the former, from the mystic relation of every number to everything intelligible to the human mind; in the latter, from the number of syllables of which each verse in the mantras consists. Plato, the ardent disciple of Pythagoras, realized this so fully as to maintain that the dodecahedron was the geometrical figure employed by the demiurgus in constructing the universe. Certain of these figures possessed a peculiarly solemn significance. For instance, 4, of which the dodecahedron is the trine, was held sacred by the Pythagoreans. It represents the perfect square, and neither of the bounding lines exceeds the other in length, by a single point. It is the emblem of moral justice and divine equity geometrically expressed. All the powers and great symphonies of physical and spiritual nature lie inscribed within the perfect square, and the ineffable name of him, which name otherwise would remain unutterable, was replaced by this sacred number for the most binding and solemn oath among the ancient mystics, the Tetractes. If the Pythagorean metempsychosis should be thoroughly expounded and compared with the modern theory of evolution, it would be found to supply every missing link in the chain of the latter. Yet who among our scientists would consent to squander his precious time over the vagaries of the ancients? Notwithstanding proofs to the contrary, they not only deny that the nations of the archaic periods, but even the ancient philosophers possessed any positive knowledge of the heliocentric system. The Venerable Bedes, the Augustines and Lactantiae appear to have smothered, with their dogmatic ignorance, all faith in the more ancient theologians of the pre-Christian centuries. But now philology and a closer acquaintance with Sanskrit literature have partially enabled us to vindicate them from these unmerited imputations. In the Vedas, for instance, we find positive proof that so long ago as 2000 BC, the Hindu sages and scholars must have been acquainted with the rotundity of our globe and the heliocentric system. Hence, Pythagoras and Plato knew well this astronomical truth, for Pythagoras obtained his knowledge in India, or from men who had journeyed there, and Plato faithfully echoed his teachings. We shall quote 2 passages from the Aitareya Brahmana. In the Serpent Mantra, the Brahmana declares as follows: that this mantra is that one which was seen by the queen of the serpents, the serpent queen, because the earth, this is the queen of the serpents, as she is the mother and queen of all that moves, moving. In the beginning she, the earth, was but a single head, round, without hair, bald, devoid of vegetation. She then perceived this mantra which confers upon him who knows it the power of assuming any form which he might desire. She pronounced the mantra, sacrifice to the gods, and, in consequence, immediately obtained a motley appearance. She became variegated, and capable of producing any form she might like. changing one form into another. This mantra commences with the words, "This cow bellows imprisoned." The depiction of the earth in the form of a round and bald head, which was soft initially, and became firm only from being breathed upon by the god Vayu, the lord of the air, forcibly suggests the concept that the authors of the sacred Vedic books knew the earth to be round or spherical, moreover, that it had been a gelatinous mass at first, which gradually cooled under the influence of the air and time. Thus much for their knowledge concerning our globe's sphericity, and now we shall present the testimony upon which we base our assertion that the Hindus were flawlessly acquainted with the heliocentric system at least 2,000 years BC. Within this same treatise the Hodar, or priest, is instructed in how the Shastras should be repeated, and how the phenomena of sunrise and sunset are to be explained. It states, "The Agnishtoma is that one, that God, who burns. The sun never sets nor rises. When the populace believes the sun is setting, it is not so, they are mistaken. For after having arrived at the conclusion of the day, it engenders two opposing effects, making night to that which is below, and day to that which is on the other side. When they, the populace, believe it rises in the morning, the sun merely acts thus. Having reached the conclusion of the night, it causes itself to produce two opposing effects, making day to that which is below, and night to that which is on the other side. In fact, the sun never sets, nor does it set for him who possesses such a knowledge." This statement is so conclusive that even the translator of the Rig Veda, Dr. Haug, felt compelled to remark upon it. He observes that this passage contains the denial of the existence of sunrise and sunset, and that the author presumes the sun to remain perpetually in its exalted position. In one of the earliest Niveds, Rishi Kutsa, a Hindu sage of the most remote antiquity, elucidates the allegory of the primordial laws given to the celestial bodies. For committing that which she ought not to do, Anahit, Anitis, or Nana, the Persian Venus, representing the earth in the legend, is sentenced to revolve around the sun. The satras, or sacrificial sessions, prove undoubtedly that so early as in the 18th or 20th century BC, the Hindus had achieved considerable progress in astronomical science. The satras endured for a single year, and were nothing less than an imitation of the sun's annual course. They were divided, says Haug, into two distinct parts, each consisting of 6 months of 30 days each. In the midst of both was the Vishuvan equator or central day, bisecting the entire satras into two halves, etc. This scholar, although he attributes the composition of the bulk of the Brahmanas to the period of 1400 to 1200 BC, is of the opinion that the oldest of the hymns may be situated at the very genesis of Vedic literature, between the years 2400 to 2000 BC. He finds no justification for considering the Vedas less ancient than the sacred texts of the Chinese. As the Shu King or Book of History, and the sacrificial songs of the Shur King or Book of Odes, have been proven to possess an antiquity dating as early as 2200 BC, our philologists may yet be compelled before long to acknowledge that in astronomical knowledge, the antediluvian Hindus were their masters. In any event, there are facts which demonstrate that certain astronomical calculations were as precise among the Chaldeans in the days of Julius Caesar as they are now. When the calendar was reformed by the conqueror, the civil year was found to correspond so poorly with the seasons that summer had merged into the autumn months, and the autumn months into the depths of winter. It was Sosigenes, the Chaldean astronomer, who restored order to the confusion by rolling back the 25th of March by 90 days, thus making it correspond with the vernal equinox, and it was Sosigenes, again, who established the lengths of the months as they now remain. In America, it was discovered by the army of Montezuma that the calendar of the Aztecs allocated an equal number of days and weeks to each month. The profound precision of their astronomical calculations was so great that no error has been detected in their reckoning by subsequent verifications, while the Europeans who landed in Mexico in 1519 were, by the Julian calendar, nearly 11 days in advance of the exact time. It is to the invaluable and meticulous translations of the Vedic books, and to the personal researches of Dr. Haug, that we are indebted for the corroboration of the claims of the Hermetic philosophers. That the era of Zarathustra Spitama Zoroaster was of untold antiquity can be readily demonstrated. The Brahmanas, to which Haug attributes an age of 4,000 years, described the religious contest between the ancient Hindus, who lived during the pre-Vedic period, and the Iranians. The battles between the Devis and the Asuras, the former representing the Hindus and the latter the Iranians, are described at length within the sacred texts. Given that the Iranian prophet was the first to raise himself against what he termed the idolatry of the Brahmins, and to designate them as the Devis, devils, how remote must this religious crisis have been? Priceless value of the Vedas. This contest, answers Dr. Haug, must have appeared to the authors of the Brahmanas to be as ancient as the feats of King Arthur appear to English writers of the 19th century. There was not a philosopher of any notoriety who did not adhere to this doctrine of metempsychosis, as taught by the Brahmins, Buddhists, and later by the Pythagoreans in its esoteric sense, whether he articulated it more or less intelligibly. Origen and Clemens Alexandrinus, Synesius and Chalcidius, all believed in it, and the Gnostics, who are unhesitatingly proclaimed by history as a body of the most refined, learned, and enlightened men, were uniformly believers in metempsychosis. Socrates entertained opinions identical to those of Pythagoras, and both, as the penalty for their divine philosophy, were put to a violent death. The rabble has remained the same throughout all ages. Materialism has been, and forever will be, blind to spiritual truths. These philosophers maintained, in accordance with the Hindus, that God had infused into matter a portion of his own divine spirit, which animates and impels every particle. They taught that mankind possesses two souls, of separate and fundamentally distinct natures. The one being perishable, the astral soul, or the inner, fluidic body, the other being incorruptible and immortal, the ogoids, or portion of the divine spirit, establishing that the mortal or astral soul perishes at each gradual transition at the threshold of every new sphere, becoming with every transmigration more purified. The astral man, intangible and invisible as he might be to our mortal earthly senses, is nevertheless constituted of matter, although sublimated. Aristotle, notwithstanding that for political reasons of his own, he maintained a prudent silence as to certain esoteric matters, expressed very clearly his opinion on the subject. It was his conviction that human souls are emanations of God, that are ultimately reabsorbed into divinity. Zeno, the founder of the Stoics, taught that there exist two eternal qualities throughout nature. The one is active or masculine, the other being passive or feminine. He held that the former is pure, subtle ether or divine spirit, while the other remains entirely inert in itself until united with the active principle. He stated that the divine spirit acting upon matter produced fire, water, earth, and air, and that it is the sole efficient principle by which all nature is moved. The Stoics, much like the Hindu sages, believed in this final absorption. Saint Justin believed in the emanation of these souls from divinity, and Tatian, the Assyrian, his disciple, declared that man was as immortal as God himself. Mutilations of the Jewish sacred books in translation. That profoundly significant verse of Genesis, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, I gave a living soul, should arrest the attention of every Hebrew scholar capable of reading the scripture in its original tongue, instead of following the erroneous translation, in which the phrase reads, "wherein there is life." From the first to the final chapters, the translators of the Jewish sacred books have misconstrued this meaning. They have even altered the spelling of the name of God, as Sir W. Drummond demonstrates. Thus El, if written correctly, would read Al, for it stands in the original La Al, and, according to Higgins, this word signifies the god Mitra, the Son, the Preserver and Savior. Sir W. Drummond demonstrates that Beth El, in its literal translation, signifies the house of the sun rather than the house of God. In the composition of these Canaanite names, El denotes soul rather than deus. Thus, theology has disfigured ancient theosophy, and science ancient philosophy. Lacking comprehension of this profound philosophical principle, the methodologies of modern science, regardless of their exactitude, must ultimately conclude in nullity. In no single discipline can science elucidate the origin and ultimate destiny of things. Instead of tracing an effect from its primal source, its progression operates in reverse. Its higher typologies, according to its own doctrines, are entirely evolved from antecedent lower forms. It commences at the nadir of the cycle, guided step by step through the vast labyrinth of nature by a mere thread of matter. The moment this thread severs and the clue is lost, it recoils in terror from the incomprehensible, confessing its own impotence. Such was not the method of Plato and his disciples. For him, the lower typologies were merely the concrete manifestations of higher abstract ideals. The immortal soul possesses an arithmetical beginning, just as the physical body possesses a geometrical one. This origin, acting as the reflection of the great universal Archus, is inherently self-moving. From its center, it diffuses itself throughout the entirety of the microcosmic body. It was the melancholy realization of this truth that compelled Tyndall to confess the powerlessness of science, even over the material realm. The primordial marshalling of atoms, upon which all subsequent action relies, baffles a power far keener than that of the microscope. Through the sheer excess of complexity, and long before empirical observation can assert any voice in the matter, the most highly trained intellect and the most refined, disciplined imagination retreat in bewilderment from the contemplation of the problem. We are struck dumb by an astonishment that no microscope can alleviate, doubting not merely the efficacy of our instruments, but even whether we possess the requisite intellectual faculties to ever grapple with the ultimate structural energies of nature. The fundamental geometrical figure of the Kabbalah, that figure which tradition and esoteric doctrine dictate was bestowed by the deity itself upon Moses on Mount Sinai, contains within its grandiose, albeit simple, combination the key to the universal problem. This single figure encompasses all others within itself. For those capable of mastering it, the exercise of imagination becomes superfluous. No earthly microscope can parallel the acute keenness of spiritual perception. Furthermore, even for those unacquainted with the great science, the description provided by a well-trained child psychometer regarding the genesis of a grain, a fragment of crystal, or any other object, transcends the value of all the telescopes and microscopes of exact science. There may reside a greater measure of truth in the adventurous pangenesis of Darwin, whom Tyndall characterizes as a soaring speculator, than in the cautious, rigidly delineated hypotheses of the latter, who, in common with other thinkers of his echelon, confines his imagination within the firm frontiers of reason. The theory of a microscopic germ encompassing within itself a universe of minor germs soars, in one sense at least, into the infinite. It transcends the material realm and unconsciously begins to occupy itself with the world of spirit. If we accept Darwin's theory regarding the development of species, we observe that his starting point is situated before an open door. We are at liberty, alongside him, either to remain within or to cross the threshold, beyond which lies the limitless and the incomprehensible, or rather the unutterable. If our mortal language proves inadequate to articulate what our spirit dimly anticipates of the great beyond while tethered to this earth, it must eventually realize it at some juncture in timeless eternity. Not so with Professor Huxley's theory of the physical basis of life. Disregarding the formidable chorus of dissenting voices from his German scientific brethren, he postulates a universal protoplasm, decreeing its cells to serve henceforth as the sacred founts of all vital principles. By declaring this principle identical across a living man, dead mutton, a nettle sting, and a lobster, by confining the life principle strictly within the molecular cell of the protoplasm, and by excluding the divine influx that accompanies subsequent evolution, he definitively closes every door against any possible escape. Like an adroit tactician, he converts his laws and facts into sentries, commanding them to mount guard over every egress. The standard beneath which he rallies them bears the inscription necessity, yet scarcely is it unfurled before he mocks its legend, dismissing it as an empty shadow of my own imagination. The fundamental doctrines of spiritualism, he asserts, reside beyond the boundaries of philosophical inquiry. We shall be bold enough to contradict this assertion, contending that they fall significantly more within the purview of such inquiry than does Mr. Huxley's protoplasm. This is true insomuch as they offer evident and palpable facts affirming the existence of spirit, whereas protoplasmic cells, once deceased, present no evidence whatsoever of being the originators or the foundational basis of life, contrary to what this foremost thinker of the day would have us believe. The ancient Kabbalist relied upon no hypothesis until its foundation could be laid upon the solid bedrock of recorded experiment. However, an excessive reliance upon physical facts precipitated the proliferation of materialism and the subsequent decadence of spirituality and faith. During the era of Aristotle, this constituted the prevailing tendency of thought. And although the Delphic commandment had not yet been entirely expunged from Grecian thought, with certain philosophers still maintaining that to comprehend what man is, one must first understand what man was, materialism had already begun to gnaw at the very roots of faith. The mysteries themselves had profoundly degenerated into mere priestly speculations and religious fraud. Few remained of the true adepts and initiates, the heirs and descendants of those scattered by the conquering swords of the various invaders of old Egypt. The epoch foretold by the great Hermes in his dialogue with Aesculapius had indeed arrived, a time when impious foreigners would accuse Egypt of worshipping monsters, and naught would survive save the letters engraved in stone upon her monuments, enigmas rendered incredible to posterity. Her sacred scribes and hierophants became wanderers upon the face of the earth, compelled by the fear of profaning the sacred mysteries to seek refuge among the Hermetic fraternities, later recognized as the Essenes. Their esoteric knowledge was buried more deeply than ever before. The triumphant blade of Aristotle's pupil swept every vestige of a once pure religion from his path of conquest, and Aristotle himself, the archetype and child of his epoch, despite being instructed in the secret sciences of the Egyptians, knew exceedingly little of this crowning culmination of millennia of esoteric study. Much like those who lived during the era of the Semitics, our contemporary philosophers seek to lift the veil of Isis, for Isis serves merely as the symbol of nature. However, they perceive only her physical forms. The indwelling soul eludes their gaze, and the Divine Mother yields no answer to them. There exist anatomists who, failing to uncover any indwelling spirit beneath the layers of muscle, the intricate network of nerves, or the cinereous matter that they lift with the point of a scalpel, boldly assert that man possesses no soul. Such individuals are as purblind in their sophistry as the student who, confining his research to the cold, literal text of the Kabbalah, dares to declare it devoid of a vivifying spirit. To perceive the true man who once inhabited the subject now lying upon the dissecting table, the surgeon must employ eyes other than those of his physical body. Likewise, the glorious truth concealed within the hieratic writings of the ancient papyri can be revealed solely to him who possesses the faculty of intuition, which, if reason is to be termed the eye of the mind, may be aptly defined as the eye of the soul. Our modern science acknowledges a supreme power, an invisible principle, yet it adamantly denies a supreme being or a personal God. Logically, the distinction between the two might be questioned, for in this instance, the power and the being are entirely identical. Human reason can scarcely conceive of an intelligent supreme power without inherently associating it with the concept of an intelligent being. The multitudes can never be expected to possess a lucid conception of the omnipotence and omnipresence of a supreme God without endowing those attributes with a colossal projection of their own personality. Yet, the Kabbalists have never regarded the invisible Ein Sof as anything other than a power. In their cautious philosophy, our contemporary positivists have thus been anticipated by millennia. What the Hermetic adept endeavors to demonstrate is that elementary common sense precludes the possibility of the universe being the product of mere chance. Such a notion appears to him more preposterous than to suppose that the theorems of Euclid were unconsciously formulated by an ape toying with geometric figures. Exceedingly few Christians comprehend, if indeed they possess any knowledge whatsoever of Jewish theology. The Talmud remains the most profound of enigmas even for the majority of Jews, whereas those Hebrew scholars who do apprehend its depths do not boast of their erudition. Their Kabbalistic tomes are even less understood by them, for in our present era, more Christian than Jewish students are engrossed in the elucidation of their profound truths. How much less, therefore, is definitively known regarding the Oriental or Universal Kabbalah. Its adepts are few, but these elect heirs of the sages, who first discovered the celestial truths that illuminated the great Shemaiah of Chaldean lore, have solved the absolute and are now resting from their monumental labors. They cannot transcend that which is granted unto the mortals of this earth to know, and no one, not even these elect, may trespass beyond the boundary inscribed by the finger of divinity itself. Travelers have encountered these adepts upon the shores of the sacred Ganges, brushed past them amid the silent ruins of Thebes, and observed them within the mysterious, deserted chambers of Luxor. Within the halls whose blue and golden vaults bear arcane signs that command attention, yet whose esoteric meaning is never penetrated by idle gazers, they have been seen though seldom recognized. Historical memoirs have documented their presence within the brilliantly illuminated salons of the European aristocracy. They have been encountered anew across the arid and desolate plains of the Great Sahara, as well as within the subterranean sanctuaries of Elephanta. They may be found everywhere, yet they make themselves known exclusively to those who have dedicated their lives to altruistic study and who are not prone to turning back. Maimonides, the illustrious Jewish theologian and historian, who at one juncture was nearly deified by his countrymen and subsequently decried as a heretic, remarks that the more absurd and devoid of sense the Talmud appears, the more sublime its secret meaning truly is. This erudite scholar successfully demonstrated that Chaldean magic, the science of Moses, and the practices of other learned thaumaturgists were founded entirely upon an extensive command of various, albeit now forgotten, branches of natural science. Being thoroughly acquainted with all the resources of the vegetable, animal, and mineral kingdoms, and acting as experts in occult chemistry and physics, as well as psychologists and physiologists, why should one marvel that the graduates or adepts, instructed within the mysterious sanctuaries of the temples, could perform wonders that, even in our enlightened era, would appear supernatural? It is an affront to human nature to brand magic and the occult sciences with the label of imposture. To believe that for countless millennia one half of humanity perpetrated deception and fraud upon the other half is tantamount to asserting that the human race was composed exclusively of charlatans and irredeemable fools. Where is the nation in which magic was not practiced? In what epoch was it wholly forgotten? Within the oldest documents presently in our possession, the Vedas and the ancient laws of Manu, we find numerous magical rites practiced and permitted by the Brahmins. Tibet, Japan, and China impart in the present era the very doctrines that were taught by the most ancient Chaldeans. The clergy of these respective nations prove, moreover, the veracity of what they teach, namely, that the practice of moral and physical purity, alongside specific austerities, cultivates the vital soul power of self-illumination. By affording man dominion over his own immortal spirit, it grants him genuinely magical powers over those elementary spirits inferior to himself. In the West, we encounter magic of an antiquity as profound as that found in the East. The Druids of Great Britain practiced it within the silent crypts of their deepest caves, and Pliny dedicates numerous chapters to the wisdom of the Celtic leaders. The Psamathes, the Druids of the Gauls, expounded upon both the physical and the spiritual sciences. They taught the secrets of the universe, the harmonious progression of the celestial bodies, the formation of the earth, and, above all else, the immortality of the soul. Within their sacred groves, natural academies constructed by the hand of the invisible architect, the initiates assembled at the still hour of midnight to learn of what man once was and what he is destined to become. They required no artificial illumination, nor life-drawing gas, to light their temples. The chaste goddess of night beamed her most silvery rays upon their oak-crowned heads, and their white-robed, sacred bards possessed the knowledge to converse with the solitary queen of the starry vault. Upon the barren soil of a long bygone past stand their sacred oaks, now withered and stripped of their spiritual significance by the venomous breath of materialism. Yet, for the student of occult learning, their foliage remains as verdant and luxuriant, and as replete with profound and sacred truths, as in that hour when the archdruid performed his magical cures and, brandishing a branch of mistletoe, severed the green bough from its mother oak with his golden sickle. Magic is as ancient as humanity itself. It is as impossible to designate the epoch when it sprang into existence as it is to specify the very day the first man was born. Whenever a writer has embarked upon the notion of connecting its initial foundation in a country to a specific historical figure, subsequent research has invariably proven such views to be groundless. Odin, the Scandinavian priest and monarch, was believed by many to have originated the practice of magic approximately 70 years BC. However, it was easily demonstrated that. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.